Vitaly Eduardovich, mass protests have been taking place in Iran for a week now. Such protests last we heard from this country in 2022. And for me, as for a Kazakh, respectively, taxes are just asking for right away. Because there were protests in Kazakhstan in 2022 too. And in Kazakhstan, just as now in Iran, the authorities turned off the internet. And the authorities also ordered the security forces to shoot in the direction of the protesters. For you. The Iranian regime has the same ally as the Kazakh one. Oh yes, an ally. Only he can't lead troops. Yes. Only in this case, he can't lead troops, that's right. Vitaly Eduardovich, apart from these external, such obvious parallels, did you find any other parallels for yourself when you followed the news? Well, we still have to remember that the Iranian regime and the Kazakh government are very difficult to compare. Because Iran is the real thing. I would say a theocratic dictatorship. And at the same time, it is necessary to remember the serious social differences, because, by and large, Iran once had a full-fledged political life. Who fought during the time of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and then during the formation of the regime of the Islamic Republic. Nevertheless, it must be recognized that Iranian society has always been very diverse in its political preferences. In Kazakhstan, as you understand, the whole political life. It has grown out of the Soviet past since the time when almost all real public political activity was suppressed. Therefore, it is obvious that the watershed lines here were completely along some other lines, which, by the way, are possible. And in the future in Iran, as it may sound paradoxical, because Iran, like Kazakhstan, is a multinational state, and there, too, various national groups have their own ideas about the future. Recall that the protests in Almaty, which took place for the first time in the Soviet Union, after the dismissal of the first secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Kazakhstan, Din Mohammad Kalakunev, began precisely because Kazakh. The students believed that the appointment to the post was an insult to the Republic. The first secretary of the Central Committee, Varyag from Moscow. Well, yes, Gennady Kolbin. The fact that the Russian was appointed, not Kazakh. The fact that the Russian was appointed, but Kunev, Kolbin, and Nursultan Nazarbayev, who replaced Kolbin, were all party functionaries. This, too, should always be taken into account. And this fact is so. There seems to be nothing like this in Iran, but we know that the current president enjoys the support of, for example, the Azerbaijani community, that there are rifts along the lines of the Shiites and the Sunni minority. One of the supporters of the protests, as you know, is Sinitsky Ayatollah, who in many ways supports are like that, I would say, the mood of his parishioners. And there is a clear understanding that the Sunnis are not, so to speak, a desirable national religious group in the Islamic Republic. There are certain lines of divergence between the Persians and everyone else. Therefore, the positions of supporters of the restoration of the monarchy in one capacity or another have now appeared, in such an already strengthened form. They talk about the Crown Prince Pahlavi, because it seems that the monarchy can unite all this. Under some, at least, general idea of the unity of the nation. And Persians, and representatives of national groups of Iran, and Sunnis and Shiites. Remember that these expectations when it was assigned in Afghanistan after the fall of the regime. Taliban on King Mohammad Zahir Shah. Yes, I remember that it will become a symbol of the already forgotten, I would say, ethnic and religious unity of Afghans. But this, unfortunately, did not happen. But nevertheless, in Iran again talking about sugar. Keeping the unity of the country is remembering the past and not trying to look into the future. Vitaly Eduardovich, and in Iran, what we are seeing now, I just remember well, here are the previous protests of 2022. They were so protracted, they were there for several months. And then I seriously hoped, I thought, well, that's it, the end of the lamps, now the Iranians will overthrow this theocratic regime. But no, then the protest was frankly drowned in blood, and the regime resisted. In your opinion, the current protest has a difference from the previous one. Previous protests, especially from the 2022 protests. But he scale no protest a lot. Because this protest, one way or another, it takes such forms as practically the control of the protesters over the cities. But again, we don't really understand what the capabilities of the Islamic Republic's power apparatus are, and the most important thing is whether these capabilities will be launched. This is also an important point, because now, among other things, there is still a certain fact. Trump, who threatens, as we understand it, those who are in power in the Islamic Republic, and threatens them precisely with possible strikes in case they sink. And they somehow want to pay attention, even if they believe that nothing will happen, to such threats. This is also an important fact. Then you also need to understand that Iranian society has never been homogeneous, that in many ways this regime is held on strength, and not on the sympathies of the overwhelming majority of the population. After all, right now we are seeing very diverse opposition groups. From left-wing oppositionists to monarchists and conservatives, and to the hidden opposition of the regime in its own ranks. And among the people who are perceived as opposition authorities, the former president of Iran, the former prime minister of Iran, during the Islamic Republic, because the days of the Shah are long gone. All the people who were then representatives of some kind of political elite, they practically do not exist anymore. And the oppositionists pin their hopes on those who worked in the system of the Islamic Republic itself. But when the Islamic Republic, in principle, was experiencing its formation, it also became the brainchild of opposition activities of very different, very diverse groups. The anti-Shah opposition spread from the radical left, often Maoists and communists from the People's Party of Iran, TUD, supported by the Soviet Union, and to extreme religious conservatives. And while Ayatollah of Khamenei returned to Iran, he formed the government, which included representatives of such Iranian conservative intelligentsia, led by Migdi Bazargan, and the leader of the Popular Front of Iran. So centrist. Then Karim Sanjabi became the Minister of Foreign Affairs in this government. And there were many other diverse political currents that came into power. But the most interesting thing is not even that, but that the last Prime Minister of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, Shapur Bakhsh, he was also a representative of the opposition. He was a man who criticized both the monarch and the government for many years. And they resorted to his services precisely because they wanted to show readiness for dialogue. It's just that time was, by and large, lost, and the protest has already been radicalized quite strongly. Thus, we can say that all these people hoped for life in a normal civilized state, simply without the omnipotence of the first person, and without political repression. As a result, they got a country in which the dictatorship is much more terrible, much more ferocious, much more disgusting, and much more irrational. Many times than the regime of the Shah. There's not even anything to compare. And this Khamenei cannot be compared with the Shah, because the comparison will always be in favor of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Both Khamenei and Khamenei are, in fact, the gravediggers of Iran. People who essentially stopped the development of a great nation. And the repression intensified many times, and the Iranians did not get any freedom. They received a kind of dogmatic regime from the distant past, within which there are disagreements about its development, but it's like the struggle of a sharp and stupid finitnik, because in order for Iran to develop, it is necessary to dismantle the regime of the Islamic Republic itself, and bring to real responsibility the leaders of the regime who are the organizers of repression. It doesn't matter at all that these people are hiding behind the name of Amalek, because, given the way they run the country, they are the real notorious atheists. I do not know, maybe they believe in someone there for themselves, but it seems to me that they believe only in their own power, and in their own ability to humiliate a compatriot. Vitaly Eduardovich, when you just recalled how the Iranian Revolution began at one time, when the Otto regime came to power, yes. There were many different political, let's say, opponents of the steppe regime, but in the end, the authorities won. These are, let's say, radical religious fanatics, let's say, who have begun to build their theocratic power. And I remember that these are still fresh memories, because I watched then, remember, and in Soviet television. Who also talked about it. And even there were pictures when they showed that people were being hanged there in Iran, public executions were carried out there. In my opinion, they even started and practiced for quite a relatively long time. And the current protest isn't it so uncollective, a certain fatigue, a certain request of society. That's it, we're tired of you. Let's change something. Therefore, I have this maybe amateurish hope that this time the protest will win. But I listen to you and other speakers, and many experts say that it is not so clear that the regime can also stand. Can the regime really stand with all this? It depends solely on what will happen to the power unit. Because the main thing on which the regime of the Islamic Republic is based is the effectiveness of its power. After all, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. If the security apparatus is sufficiently effective in dispersing protests and in repressing protesters, there is no doubt that the regime of the Islamic Republic can stand for many more years. But we don't know how effective this mode is. You understand that the current protests, they are, as it were, also postponed as a result of Iran's defeat of the 12-day war. Because everyone saw that Iran absolutely does not have the power that Ayatollah Khamenei proclaims. That he is not capable of giving any real answer to either the United States or Israel. That all of his threats, they are largely inflated. The United States, if they wish, they get to the deepest vaults of nuclear material. This, of course, raises questions not only for the people, but also for the elite. And besides, you understand that any losing regime is no longer regarded as an absolute force by those who live in the country. A military defeat is always a prologue of unrest. But again, not every unrest, we know this by the way, from the history of the Russian Empire, leads to the collapse of the regime. Excitement leads. We don't know how far it will take place now. Look, we've seen a lot of different protests. And everywhere we could state one simple thing. Where the security forces were loyal to the regime, they could defend the regime. Even if it was mass protests. If we compare the Ukrainian Maidan of 2013 to 2014, and the Belarusian Square of 2020, what distinguished them first of all? The effectiveness of the Belarusian security forces, who were all imprisoned by the long-term dictator Alexander Lukashenko. Because all this time, Lukashenko is faster. The power structure of Belarus as its own personal Praetorian Guard. These people do not protect Belarus at all, they do not protect the national interests of Belarus. Like the disgusting Lukashenko himself. They protect the personal interests of the dictator and his criminal family. And there was no such power apparatus in Ukraine. Yanukovych was already the fourth president of the country. At the same time, both he and his predecessors were in difficult relations with parliaments, with big business. People who were in law enforcement agencies could ask themselves, why should we shoot people? When this president may cease to be the head of state, literally, if not in a month. In a couple of years, lose the election, and we will be switchers, because we do not know who will be his heir. We don't know who will be the heir. That's the most important thing. And won't he take us to court for defending the previous president, even if the protest is suppressed? How old us of a quiet life is given in this situation? And so, in fact, the Maidan had much more opportunities to win than the square, even when the security forces, the part of them that was completely frostbitten, started shooting at the protesters. It couldn't have been a mass crackdown anyway. And the protesters themselves could not be afraid of the security forces because they knew what they had. There is a parliamentary representation. And now look at Kazakhstan in 2022. I just wanted to remind you about this. Yes, you do not have such a strong power apparatus because 2022 is already the second president of Kazakhstan. This is already a clan squabble, this is already a difficult relationship in the elite. The relations of both Nazarbayev and Tokayev with big business, and what is Moscow doing? What it could not afford in Ukraine, it introduces its troops under the auspices of the so-called STO. Of course, violating both the status of this organization and the possibility of conducting troops. Because it is clear that there is no external one. There was no invasion of Kazakhstan, that it was an invention of Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. In order to allow the appearance of these foreign troops on the land of Kazakhstan. But it just becomes more of a signal to the Kazakh security forces that they are supported not by their own regime, but by the Kremlin. If Russian troops had not entered Kazakhstan then, it is not known how the protest events themselves would have unfolded. But the political events in the following week, it is quite possible that Kazakhstan would have been a different country, we do not know. But here's a very good illustration for you too. But now we see on the one hand, an effective, bloody, cruel one. The power apparatus of Iran. And on the other hand, we see how much this apparatus is constrained by the fear of many representatives of the elite regarding the unpredictable reaction of the President of the United States. I understand correctly, that is, exactly with this. This demonstrative saber-rattling and such bellicose statements on the part of Iran's political elite, including the security forces, are explained under false fear. Well, of course, but they have to do something. And then see that there is a discrepancy between them. It is Khamenei, by and large, who calls for reprisals against demonstrators. And President Pezeshkian talks about dialogue with the protesters. It's not exactly the same position. Therefore, this also needs to be taken into account. Vitaly Eduardovich, again, returning to the protests of 2022. Perhaps my vision will seem amateurish to you, but nevertheless, in 2022 it seemed to me that this protest, in part, was unsuccessful because among the protesters, among the Iranian. Of course, there was still such a thing. What? Well, the opinion that we can still work with these adels, but if they make any concessions, so be it, we will leave the street. Because I remember, then the main reason for people to go out on the street was these scarves, which forced women to dress up. And the women's protest became such a push. And we remember that after these protests, the regime really made some concessions. He said that yes, woman, I have to wrap myself in all black, yes, there with scarves, let's talk and so on. But in this current protest, it seems to me that society in general does not even have a hint. That they think that something can be agreed with the regime, or that the regime will make any concessions. Society demands everything quite radically, get out, and this is death to the dictator and so on. Or is this an erroneous opinion? Do you know any Iranian protest has some kind of reason? The current protest also has an economic reason. It was not by chance that it began in the bazaars of Iran. And it is no accident that they then rolled back all their economic decisions. In other words, they did the same thing as in 2022. It's just that the protest, obviously, did not have the mass character and, I would say, such readiness for further struggle as the current protest. We have to watch the developments. But there were reasons here too. Let's say the protest of 2022 was much more politicized initially than the protest of 2026. This is an economic protest that has become a political one. That protest was political from the very beginning because these are political demands. Headscarves are one of the ideological staples of the Islamic Republic. Nevertheless, people began to speak out against ideology, realizing how zealously representatives of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and other radicals in the leadership of Iran treat them. Well, without any doubt, this also needs to be understood. The current protesters quickly switched from economic slogans to political ones. It happens so often. Again, look, in 2020 in Belarus people went to rallies, first of all, demanding to cancel the results of the falsified presidential elections of the country. They just wanted another election, they wanted a recount. But when it became clear that the regime of Alexander Lukashenko continues, insist on his imaginary victory in the presidential elections, slogans began regarding Lukashenko's resignation from the post of head of state. Red and white flags appeared. Belarusian, because you know that Belarus actually exists not under its national, not under its state flag, but under completely invented symbolism. This is the symbolism of the Lukashenko regime and its gang. It has nothing to do with the Belarusian statehood. It's just that this is not a Soviet symbolism, under which Lukashenko and his group hide the destruction of the statehood of the Republic of Belarus and the Belarusian people, for the sake of plundering and the resources of this one, the long-suffering country of Lukashenko and his Russian masters. Here it was. But this flag was not popular because the overwhelming number of residents of Belarus lived in this populist fog for many years. They themselves did not understand what the state of Belarus was. They themselves did not understand that since 1994, this is a fake state that has actually lost its subjectivity. And as soon as people uttered these words that Lukashenko should be kicked out, or even better put in jail, then, of course, real flags of Belarus immediately appeared, which, I hope, sooner or later after the collapse of the dictator and the trial at the bottom, they will develop over the state institutions of the restored Belarusian state. But in Iran, it seems to me that, again, I do not presume to say that I understand everything correctly. It seems to me that now is just the same. I personally have no doubt that the protesters will win. Well, here I have such a picture. It's clear that I don't see the whole picture, especially in conditions when the internet was turned off in Iran throughout the country. We generally see some episodic pictures now. According to some reports, it seems that the security forces are going over to the side of the protesters, according to other reports. On the contrary, they are gesturing there and shooting at everything that moves, and they have set up roadblocks everywhere. But for some reason it seemed to me, and it still seems to me, that this is the last dial that has just begun. We will hear the news that Ayatollah has moved on a Russian plane towards Russia to seek political asylum. That's what it seems to me. You know, I always believe that when it comes to mass protests, it is necessary to expect developments. Because, I say again, you and I cannot foresee either the scope of the movement or the capabilities of the security forces in this suppression of protesters. Control over the centers of the country, over Tehran, is very important. While we do not understand what is happening in the capital, we can talk about the outskirts, but you understand that even if you capture cities on the outskirts or just small cities, then the government, if it retains overall control, it will sooner or later will achieve the restoration of control over the cities. Therefore, I sincerely wish the protesters in Iran victory and the restoration of normal life lost after the tragic events of 1979. But I would wait with any forecast. Vitaly Eduardovich, by the way, I wanted to talk about this. In the network, under all publications about the protests in Iran, as a rule, you can always find several comments in which people with different levels of competence or expertise, they say that Israel seems to be behind these protests there. Others say no, it's therefore a reason that Trump is now brandishing his threats. These are all Americans. As always, in such cases, when people protest against dictators, there are always some experts which say that it's not just that the protesters came out, but because there are some external forces. If you put all this husk aside, all this conspiracy and so on, Vitaly Eduardovich, in your opinion, are there really countries in the region other than Israel? It is clear that it has its own accounts with the Otto regime. Besides Israel, are there any other countries in the region that are interested in winning the protests? I think a lot of Iran's neighbors are interested in the victory of the protests. Not only Israel. Because everyone understands how dangerous, aggressive, unpredictable the regime is in Iran. I think Azerbaijan is quite interested in the collapse of this regime, because it poses a rather serious existential threat to Azerbaijan in one way or another. Turkey is interested in the fall of the regime, because this is an endless competition between Turkey and Iran for influence in the region. Saudi Arabia is interested in the fall of the regime, because Saudi Arabia is a Sunni theocracy. And when there is a Shiite Islamic republic with a significant, as you know, Shiite minority in Saudi Arabia, it is clear that this kind of regime contradicts Saudi national interests. Bahrain, with its Shiite majority and Sunni dynasty, is interested in the fall of the Islamic Republic, in order to have more or less civilized relations with Iran. Iraqi Sunnis are interested in the fall of this regime because they are always afraid of radicalization of the mood of Shiites in their own country. Lebanese Christians and Sunnis are interested in the fall of Iran because, in fact, it trampled Lebanese statehood by the forces of the extremist organization Hezbollah. This is a Shiite organization. That is, it's like the murder of Agatha Christie on the Orient Express. There are so many people who want the Atta regime to fall that we can spend the entire broadcast listing them. Vitaly just. When you listed Iran's neighboring countries, you listed, well, with the exception of Turkey, again, in quotation marks. Probably all countries are not democratic. I sincerely believed that as time autocrats easier to just agree with each other. And they just do not interested in the fact that they have at hand another autocratic regime fell. That they are just the same. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think these are different models of autocracy. Autocrats do not always agree among themselves. And I have listed the regimes that, well, first of all, Turkey is not an autocratic regime. It is a regime with such a complex, I would say, democracy. Azerbaijan is not a monarchy, but these are all monarchies. Both Saudi Arabia and Bahrain are monarchical regimes. And in Iran, the monarchical power was overthrown. People who overthrew the government, and even under Shiite slogans. For Snika monarchs always dangerous revolutionaries, whatever they mode. At the same time, we remember Syria. After the civil war broke out in Syria, after the protests, and we see that the state practically found itself in a catastrophe. And among ordinary people, of course, looking at Iran, now the following question may arise: will it not turn out that if the regime falls in Iran now, but the protest forces cannot agree, not? Will we get another country, for example in Syria, where there will be a civil war? In your opinion, is this possible? Perhaps because the opposition forces are very diverse. It is completely unclear whether they will be able to find a common language among themselves in case of victory. This is indeed a serious danger, but at the same time, we must say that the Iranian statehood itself still has deep traditions. And if these traditions prevail, if a certain center appears, ready to seek consensus between various national and religious groups, if the struggle for the preservation of stability will be, former forces of the regime itself are involved, ready to dismantle it. The reformist part of this regime, if it exists at all today, then maybe this danger will be avoided. But it is obviously greater than ever. And is there, in your opinion, besides those Libyans, anyone who can now become such a consolidated representative? The opposition of this protest face. I think there are a lot of different leaders and a lot of different claims. And, again, there are many leaders both in Iran itself and outside of Iran. This also needs to be understood. But again, I said that among these people, who are largely perceived as a kind of driving force for change, there are people who were part of the regime. Former Iranian President Mohammad Khatami, for example, former Iranian Prime Minister Mir Hassan Mousavi, who has not appeared in public for many years. Some kind of symbol of change, that the Prime Minister of the Islamic Republic, former President Hassan Rouhani. There are people who are perceived as some kind of reformers. The regime itself. But I do not know how much their time will not go away now, as you understand. And in this sense, it is very difficult to say how it will look, and to what extent all these figures. Even among the Ayatollahs themselves, there are very many people who are the heirs of the political Ayatollahs. Montazari, Ayatollah Hashemi Rafsanjani, former president of Iran. They are no longer there, but nevertheless, they have some kind of political legacy. People protect this political heritage. Therefore, there are so many different trends and groupings here that I can tell you in conclusion of our conversation that there is no need to talk about consolidation as such, so everyone turns to the son of the Shah because he may not embody such heterogeneity. Vitaly Eduardovich, the last question. When I watched your interviews and various speeches until today, you mentioned this axis several times: Venezuela, Iran, Moscow. Venezuela, Maduro, it is now known where. Very strange things are happening with Iran now, too. In your opinion, if the regime falls in Iran, in the context of the war in Ukraine, can it have a big impact. After all, Iran has always flashed in this war before as a supplier of these terrible drones, Shaheds. Well, I think that drones have been manufactured in Russia itself for a long time, but in any case, it is clear that any weakening of the positions of Russia's allies, because it does not have so many of them, it affects the future events in the Russian-Ukrainian war. The fewer allies there are in Russia, the sooner the Russian-Ukrainian war will end. Well, as much as it can just affect me, that's what it will be. Now it will be quite difficult to say, because it may also be related to the energy potential, with its consequences, with oil prices. Now about the strength or weakness of influence to speak of, because let's not forget that for all these countries is a country that buys their oil. This is China. Oh yeah, I agree. Vitaly Eduardovich, thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your very important expert opinion. It was a very interesting conversation for me personally, and I think for our viewers. Thank you, Mr. Kodyarov. Good luck. Thank you. Have a nice day.